Imagine a morning in May 1945, but there are no bells of triumph ringing, nor any red hammer and sickle flags fluttering atop the ruined Reichstag. Instead, Winston Churchill sits huddled in a dark, suffocating bunker in London, his hands trembling as he signs the most humiliating surrender treaty in the history of the British Empire. Thousands of miles away, in the quiet skies above New York, Americans anxiously look up at the clouds, terrified that one day V-3 intercontinental ballistic missiles carrying nuclear warheads from the Third Reich will rain down upon them. This entire dark nightmare, a scenario the free world narrowly escaped, actually hung by a thread on a single decision made by a dictator at the dawn of June 22, 1941. History always teaches us that the Axis powers lost because they were inferior in every aspect, from manpower to resources. But the chilling truth is that they once held the golden key to absolute victory, and they threw it away on that fateful day. What if the 3 million most elite soldiers of the German war machine had not received the order to march into the giant meat grinder on the Eastern Front? There would be no exhaustingly bloody battles in Stalingrad, no ragged marches in the blinding white snow bringing cold death, and of course, there would never be the fall of Berlin in the spring of 1945. Instead of committing suicide by diving headfirst into an irredeemable two-front war, Hitler could have restrained his ideological paranoia and decided to uphold the Molotov-Ribbentrop non-aggression pact with Joseph Stalin. The result of that restraint would be a fortress Europe, so impenetrable that no power could breach it, a great British Empire strangled to a premature death in the Mediterranean, and an isolated United States of America, forced to bow before a nuclear-armed superpower named the Third Reich. But before delving deep into those dark visions, we need to dissect one of the most fiercely debated points in modern history, one that still deeply divides scholars today. That is the icebreaker theory by historian Viktor Suvorov. Many believe that Hitler's breaking of the pact and attacking the Soviet Union was the insane act of a megalomaniac. But the icebreaker theory throws a completely different perspective at us. Was Stalin truly an innocent victim stabbed in the back? According to declassified documents, the Soviet Union at that time was frantically preparing for a preemptive strike campaign named Operation Groza, Operation Thunderstorm, scheduled for July 1941. Stalin was simply waiting for Hitler's war machine to wear down its vitality in clashes with Britain and France, so the Red Army could sweep across Western Europe like a liberating flood. From this viewpoint, Germany's Operation Barbarossa was not an arrogant move, but a desperately proactive, strike-first blow, a life-or-death effort to save Germany from annihilation from the east. This truth forces us to ask the question again, in the ruthless geopolitical chessboard of 1941, who was truly the hunter, and who was the prey? However, whether Hitler's motive was defensive or offensive, the decision to break with the Soviet Union remained a fatal economic suicide. The economy of Nazi Germany under ministers Hjalmar Schacht and later Hermann Göring operated essentially like a massive pyramid scheme, a ruthless military Ponzi machine. It consumed budgets at an unimaginable rate and could only survive by plundering gold, resources, and labor from conquered nations. But ironically, prior to 1941, the Soviet Union itself served as the most effective blockade breaker for the German Empire. Despite ideological hostility, in the brief period from 1940 to 1941 alone, trains from the east diligently transported millions of tons of grain, hundreds of thousands of tons of manganese ore, and nearly 1 million tons of precious oil to feed the Wehrmacht's war machine. Nazi Germany was living parasitically on the abundant resources of its future enemy. Without the madness of June 22, this massive economic lifeblood would have continued to flow relentlessly into Germany's veins. They would never have known fuel shortages, the U-boat fleet would have dominated the Atlantic, and the Luftwaffe would have ruled the skies without facing any limits. Let's reopen the top-secret archives of the OKW, the German High Command, to see that Hitler's inner circle once had a perfectly sharp and chilling alternative plan, Operation Felix. If they hadn't poured 3/4 of their entire military strength into the vast Russian steppes, the German war machine would have pointed its spearhead southwest, aiming straight for the jugular of the British Empire. The ultimate goal of Operation Felix was the Rock of Gibraltar, the sole gateway connecting the vast Atlantic Ocean with the inland Mediterranean Sea. The most brilliant German military minds, such as Panzer General Heinz Guderian and Naval Admiral Erich Raeder, pleaded and even begged Hitler to focus all efforts on capturing this fatal weak point. Imagine tens of thousands of elite Fallschirmjäger paratroopers, the madmen who had once fallen from the sky and broken the British garrison at Crete, now darkening the skies of Spain and delivering a thunderous blow to Gibraltar. With overwhelming power and undivided forces, the fall of this rock would only be a matter of days. Once the swastika flag flew atop Gibraltar, the most devastating domino would fall. The mighty British Royal Navy would be locked in, completely cut off from its lifeline reaching the Suez Canal and the endless oil fields of the Middle East. The Mediterranean would inevitably turn into an Axis backyard pond. Without supplies from Asia and Africa, Great Britain would no longer be a resilient island fortress, but a giant prison, besieged and starved. Prime Minister Winston Churchill, no matter how made of steel and indomitable his spirit, could not use heroic speeches to feed millions of citizens exhausted by famine and bombs. Under the circumstances of total economic collapse and tremendous pressure from a closed peace faction right within the foggy government, London would be forced to its knees. A humiliating peace treaty would be signed, handing over the entire European continent to German domination in exchange for keeping a few battered overseas colonies. Britain would be knocked out of the war as early as 1942. But the butterfly effect of Germany not invading the Soviet Union would not stop at Europe, it would spread globally, creating a devastating geopolitical tsunami that would permanently alter the Pacific theater. Recall the context at the time. The Japanese Empire was bogged down in the war in China and eager to expand southwards to seize resources. However, they were always terrified of the massive threat from the Russian Bear to the north. If the Soviet Union were not drawn into a life-or-death struggle with Germany in the west, Stalin would have a free hand to concentrate his focus and dozens of battle-hardened Red Army divisions on the Manchurian border, ready to crush Japan's Guangdong Army. Faced with the suffocating threat of an unweakened continental power, the Japanese militarist elite would undoubtedly tremble. Would they dare to recklessly execute the historic surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, drawing the wrath of the Americans, when behind their backs tens of thousands of Stalin's artillery barrels were waiting? The answer is almost certainly no. Japan would choose to stand down, or compromise to avoid a suicidal two-front war. And if Japanese bombs did not fall on the Pacific Fleet on that morning in December 1941, America's history would also take a completely different turn. At that time, isolationism in the United States was still an overwhelming political force. Millions of Americans had no desire to send their children to an old continent drowning in a sea of blood. Despite all the efforts and foresight of President Franklin D. Roosevelt, he would never have the perfect excuse and public outrage to declare war and bring America into the conflict. The grand Germany first strategy would vanish into thin air, simply because America had no reason to intervene, and no ally strong enough to serve as a stepping stone in Europe once Britain had fallen. The German army, without losing millions of young men and tens of thousands of tanks in the cold Russian snow, would leisurely fortify the Atlantic Wall. Instead of facing just a few dozen divisions on the historic D-Day, any Allied landing attempt, if at all possible, would have to crash head-on into a steel wall of over 300 elite German divisions, armed to the teeth. It would not be a liberation, but the largest mass execution in human history. The true terror lay not only in the armies on the ground, but in the blinding light of destruction quietly nurtured in the silent laboratories of Germany. The historical Eastern Front was a massive black hole, swallowing all the financial, material, and intellectual resources of the Third Reich. Hitler once extremely labeled quantum physics Jewish physics and turned his back on the Uranverein atomic bomb project. But assume, when his empire was not facing daily existential threats, not desperately draining itself to produce tens of thousands of panzer tanks only for them to become scrap metal in the Kursk salient. Those endless resources would be reallocated. Germany's most brilliant scientific minds would be granted unlimited budgets. The Vemork heavy water plant in Norway, a vital element for a nuclear reactor, would not be easily sabotaged by Allied commando teams, as it would be surrounded by an impenetrable anti-aircraft grid and armored divisions. Germany's technological machine would develop at a blistering pace without interruption. Not stopping at the nuclear project, a free hand on the Eastern Front would trigger a true golden age for the Third Reich's wonder weapons, Wunderwaffe. History records that the Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter arrived too late and in too few numbers to reverse the tide in the skies. But paint a different picture, when billions of Reichsmarks and hundreds of thousands of engineers were not buried under the thick snow of Russia. Jet fighters faster than any Allied propeller plane would enter mass production at least 2 years earlier. The European skies would be absolutely dominated by these speed ghosts. Any attempt by the U.S. Army Air Forces or the Royal Air Force to conduct strategic bombing campaigns into German territory would turn into collective suicide missions. The legendary B-17 flying fortresses would drop like autumn leaves against the superior firepower of the Me-262. Unravaged by bombs, the massive industrial centers of the Ruhr would operate at full capacity day and night, spawning increasingly sophisticated killing machines, including intercontinental ballistic missile projects like the A9/A10, or the America Bomber project, technological monsters designed with the sole purpose of carrying destruction across the Atlantic to sow terror on Manhattan. Put yourself in the position of the top leadership in Washington during that dark scenario. When intelligence reports returned that London had surrendered, that the west coast of Europe had turned into an impregnable fortress of reinforced concrete, and that German scientists had begun testing mushroom clouds in the North African desert, America, the cradle of liberty, would suddenly find itself completely isolated on its own continent. The isolationist, America First strategy would now become a bitter and mandatory reality. The concept of Mission Impossible would not just be a movie title, but the most accurate phrase to describe any intention to militarily intervene in Europe. The United States would have to retreat into a hemisphere defense strategy, pooling all resources to protect the land and sea borders of the Americas, stretching from Alaska down to the tip of South America's Horn. The dream of a crusade to liberate the world would be extinguished, replaced by a prolonged, suffocating, and paranoid Cold War between a shrinking democracy on one side, and a fascist empire possessing superior technology on the other, relentlessly expanding its influence into Africa and the Middle East. But the false silence of this world would be overshadowed by a calm man smoking a pipe in the Kremlin, Joseph Stalin. Presenting the hypothetical that Germany did not invade the Soviet Union does not mean that eternal peace would exist between the two most hostile ideologies of the 20th century. Stalin was no naive fool lulled to sleep by flimsy pieces of treaty paper. He was a master of patience and ruthless calculation. Seeing the British Empire fall and Germany busy consolidating power in Western Europe, Stalin would utilize every precious minute and second that history inadvertently granted to execute a massive and comprehensive overhaul of the Soviet war machine. The mistakes of the past internal purges would be rectified by training a generation of young, sharp generals well-versed in modern warfare. Behind the Ural Mountains, far from the reach of any German bomber, massive industrial complexes would operate unceasingly. Tens of thousands of T-34 tanks and heavy KV-IS tank variants with terrifying firepower would roll off the assembly lines in droves. Stalin would sit back and watch the capitalist powers tear each other apart, waiting for the moment Germany and the rest of the Western world were exhausted, before delivering the final, fatal blow. At that time, it would not be Germany attacking the Soviet Union, but the iron-willed Red Armored Legions who would proactively swarm across the Polish border, detonating a new world war of magnitudes and destructive power exponentially greater, a war that could be decided by nuclear weapons in the skies of Europe. We also cannot ignore the most horrifying dark side of this alternate historical scenario, a dark corner so brutal that words can hardly fully describe it. If the German army was not crushed on the Eastern Front, and the Red Army never made its great march to Berlin, the gates of hell at Auschwitz, Treblinka, or Sobibor would never be opened by liberating soldiers. The Nazi industrial genocide machine would operate at maximum capacity and be perfected smoothly, encountering no obstacles from Allied airstrikes or advancing armies. Generalplan Ost, Master Plan for the East, a demonic blueprint aimed at ethnic cleansing and enslaving the entire Eastern European region to create living space, Lebensraum, for the Aryans, would be ruthlessly executed. Tens of millions of Slavs, Jews, Romani people, and other minorities would be systematically wiped off the map of humanity completely. Their cultures, languages, and lives would be crushed under the boot of a totalitarian regime, creating a demographic void and a permanent moral wound that could never be healed in the history of human civilization. The world would not only be ruled by evil, but that evil would be legalized, optimized, and normalized in an empire of darkness lasting for decades. It was the madness of extreme ideology that blinded Adolf Hitler, making him ignore every most basic strategic logic of military art. By tearing up the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact on a summer morning, he thought he was opening the door to absolute power, but in reality, that dictator was personally signing a death warrant, not only for himself but for the entire regime he took such pains to build. Ironically, the survival of the free world, of today's Western democracies, inadvertently owes a massive blood debt to the greatest mistake of history's greatest enemy. Millions of Red Army soldiers fell on endless steppes, using their bodies as meat shields to drain the vitality of the fascist monster, buying with blood the priceless time for the Allies to recover and counterattack. History has no ifs, but reopening top-secret plans dusted by time like Operation Felix or reanalyzing the underlying economic currents behind diplomatic treaties helps us realize that the line between victory and annihilation was actually chillingly thin. The world we breathe in, the basic freedoms we take for granted, once hovered on the edge of a dark abyss, and was only salvaged by the self-destructive blindness of a tyrant. But the complete picture of a world without the Soviet-German War would not be truly complete if we did not cast our eyes beyond the borders of Europe, to witness the devastating geopolitical earthquake spreading across other continents. Look toward North Africa and the scorching dunes of the Middle East, where the fate of the world's most massive resources was decided. In the actual timeline, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel and his Desert Fox Corps created legends, but ultimately suffered defeat due to shortages of ammunition, fuel, and troop reinforcements because all resources were thrown into the meat grinder in Russia by Hitler. Now, imagine a completely reversed scenario. No longer having to share supplies with the Eastern Front, Rommel's Corps would receive unprecedented backing from thousands of Stuka dive bombers and fleets of logistical ships relentlessly crossing the Mediterranean, which had now become an Axis backyard pond after the fall of Gibraltar. The British defensive line at El Alamein, no matter how resilient, would be crushed like sandcastles before an armored tsunami. German troops would sweep through Egypt, seize the Suez Canal, and from there, the door to the endless oil treasures of the Middle East would swing wide open before their eyes. The fall of the Middle East would trigger devastating domino effects for the entire structure of the British Empire. In Iraq, the nationalist uprising led by Rashid Ali al-Gilani, instead of being quickly squashed by British troops as in reality, would receive direct support from German paratroopers and Air Force. The oil wells in Kirkuk and Abadan would fall into the hands of the Third Reich, providing an eternal energy source to feed their giant war machine. Furthermore, the presence of the German army in the Middle East would create a fatal link to another boiling front, India. The jewel in the crown of the British Empire was then shaking with independence movements. The nationalist leader Subhas Chandra Bose, who actually sought help from both Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan in reality, would now have a perfect launching pad. Free Indian mercenary divisions, equipped and trained by Germany, coupled with the pressure from the Japanese army in Burma, would form a giant pincer strangling the British colonial government in New Delhi. The empire on which the sun never sets would be torn apart from the inside, reduced to fragmented pieces drifting in a strange new world order. As the UK fell in Europe and lost its most important colonies, a wave of flight would create an unprecedented political migration in human history. The British royal family, along with the remnants of Churchill's cabinet, would be forced to cross the Atlantic, seeking asylum in Canada, the last stronghold of the Commonwealth. Ottawa would become the exiled capital of a lost kingdom, where the last British soldiers harbored dreams of restoration in despair. However, their presence also meant that the specter of war would press against America's northern border. The United States, now strategically encircled, would plunge into a state of paranoia and extreme militarization like never before. Forget the golden age of 1950s America with its peaceful suburbs and booming consumer culture. In this timeline, America would turn into a closed fortress, a true police state. McCarthyism would erupt earlier and with 100 times more hysteria, as the fear of German spies, fascist fifth columnists, and the nuclear threat haunted every corner of society. Trillions of dollars would be poured into building coastal anti-aircraft systems, massive military bases running along the East Coast, and deep underground fallout shelters. The Statue of Liberty would have to gaze out over a sea riddled with mines and predatory U-boats prowling right off the coast of New York. While the rest of the world was engulfed in fear and darkness, in the heart of Europe, Adolf Hitler would embark on realizing his most megalomaniacal dream, turning Berlin into Welthauptstadt Germania, the world capital. Unhindered by Allied bombs or financial shortages, Albert Speer's gargantuan architectural blueprints would come to life. The architectural canvas of Germania would be a breathtaking combination of utter magnificence and utter inhumanity. The Volkshalle, People's Hall, with a massive dome capable of holding hundreds of thousands of people, so tall it could create its own clouds and rain from the breath of the crowd inside, would rise to blot out the sky. Expansive boulevards, colossal triumphal arches, and cold granite government buildings would be built on the blood and bones of millions of slave laborers brought in from all over the conquered territories. Germania would not just be a city, it would be an eternal stone monument carving the arrogance of an ideology that considered itself superior, a testament to how evil, when equipped with power and time, could create grand yet spiritually hollow structures. However, beneath the glamour of the expansive boulevards and the remarkable technological progress, the Third Reich still harbored an irredeemable seed of self-destruction. Even without the Soviet Red Army knocking on the door in the east, Hitler's regime would soon have to face an invisible and equally dangerous enemy, the aging and illness of the Führer himself. In the late 1940s, Hitler's Parkinson's disease, combined with a lifestyle reliant on stimulants prescribed by his personal physician Theodore Morell, would turn him into a withered shadow. As the brain controlling that massive machine began to rot, a bloody and silent succession crisis would erupt in the shadows of the corridors of power. The Third Reich was never a unified bloc, it was a collection of power-hungry factions, maintained by Hitler's art of divide and rule. When the power vacuum appeared, a civil war between monsters like Heinrich Himmler of the powerful SS, Hermann Göring of the Luftwaffe, and possibly cold technocratic minds like Albert Speer or Reinhard Heydrich, would shake Europe to its roots. This crisis might not be resolved by votes or political negotiations, but by assassinations, internal concentration camps, and bloody purges right in the heart of the capital Germania. If Himmler's SS faction won, the world would witness the birth of an absolute secret police state, a black order, where theories of mysticism and racial purity would dictate every aspect of life. In another scenario, if the military technocrats of the Wehrmacht overthrew the SS, they might establish a more traditional military dictatorship, less fanatical ideologically but more ruthless in optimizing the economic exploitation machine against the rest of Europe. Whichever faction seized power, the brutal nature of the regime would remain unchanged. It would simply transition from a phase of frantic expansion to a phase of maintaining domination through terror, turning the entire European continent into a giant prison with black leather-clad guards and inhumane laboratories, where human beings were demoted to mere numbers and pure tools of labor. While darkness blanketed Europe and a fearful America retreated into itself, a haunting space race would begin decades earlier than in actual history. Wernher von Braun and the rocket scientists at the Piedmont Center would not have to surrender to the Americans to join the Apollo project. Under the endless financial patronage of the new Third Reich, their vision would reach beyond the atmosphere. Imagine in the early 1950s, instead of the beep-beep of the Sputnik satellite echoing on global radio waves, the whole world would shudder to witness an artificial satellite bearing the cold swastika symbol orbiting the Earth. Outer space, the ultimate symbol of humanity's freedom and exploration, would be tainted by the hegemonic ambitions of the fascist bloc. Military space stations capable of launching weapons from orbit onto any city on Earth, lunar exploration projects not for scientific purposes but to plant flags and claim Aryan sovereignty. The advancement of science and technology, instead of elevating humanity, would become the ultimate tool to chain it. But let's temporarily take our eyes off the stars to return to the ground, where another phantom was still quietly accumulating power in the shadows of the vast taiga forests. While Berlin was engrossed in granite boulevards and test flights of missiles, on the other side of the border, the man of steel, Joseph Stalin, was carrying out the most massive human transformation ever seen. Undevastated by war in its key industrial zones, the Soviet Union would not only recover but rise to become a true fortress of steel. New industrial cities sprouted like mushrooms after rain east of the Urals, where millions of workers labored in an atmosphere of iron discipline, producing legions of T-54 tanks and MiG-15 jet fighters decades early. Stalin understood that the parallel existence between these two ideologies was only a temporary pause in history. He was waiting for the final crisis of capitalism and fascism. A controversial scenario we need to consider is, what would happen if in 1950, it was the Soviet Union that tore up the treaty? Imagine a winter morning, when tens of thousands of Katyusha rocket launchers simultaneously roared along the Polish dividing line, signaling the start of the Great War of Liberation from the east. This would not merely be a war to defend the motherland, but a red whirlwind sweeping across Europe with the goal of painting the entire continent red. By then, the world would witness a clash between two technological monsters, Germany's super heavy Maus tanks facing off against swarms of amphibious tanks and heavy Soviet armor. A war where the line between liberator and invader became blurred in tactical nuclear smoke. The audience would have to ask themselves, would a Europe under Stalin's rule be any better than a Europe under Hitler's boot? The debate over the lesser of two evils would explode intensely right in the comments section of this video. And while the two continental giants growled at each other, we cannot forget a third factor being cornered, the United States of America. Economically isolated, cut off from crucial resources in the Middle East and Southeast Asia, America would be forced to undergo an internal revolution. Instead of being an arsenal of democracy, as in reality, America would become a laboratory of survival. In this timeline, the Manhattan Project would not just be a mission to build a bomb, but an all-out effort to create new energy technologies to escape dependence on oil now held by the Axis powers. We could see an America march straight into the era of nuclear and renewable energy as early as the 1950s. The tripolar competition between Germany, mechanics and nuclear, the Soviet Union, manpower and armor, and America, electronics and new energy, would create a geopolitical map more complex and dangerous than any period in history. But there is a cruel reality that no technology can cover up, the internal rot of empires built on fear. The Third Reich, despite its military victories, would soon have to face the disease of affluence. The new aristocracies of the Nazi Party would gradually descend into luxurious vices, and internal power struggles would erode the efficiency of the administrative apparatus. In the occupied territories, the smoldering fires of resistance would never go out. From the mountains in Norway to the wine cellars in Paris, guerrilla movements would receive secret support from the US and Canada. Assassinations, railway sabotages, and most importantly, an information war via pirate radio stations would gradually awaken the conscience of those living under the grip. A physical Berlin Wall might never exist, but a psychological Iron Curtain would divide Europe into millions of shards of suspicion. Look deep into the future of the 1970s in this scenario. As the first generation of fanatics passed away, the second generation born into velvet and propaganda would begin to question the lies of the regime. The economic stagnation of an overly centralized model, coupled with the massive military costs to maintain dominance, would lead to a slow but certain collapse. Not through a spectacular landing like D-Day, but an unraveling from within, much like how the greatest empires in history usually end. A continent-wide, velvet revolution, where armored legions no longer wished to open fire on their own people. The world then would have to struggle to clean up the ruins of a dark era, with massive nuclear arsenals scattered in the hands of rebel factions. So, what do we ultimately learn from this what-if hypothesis? Hitler's failure to invade the Soviet Union might have brought him a temporary victory, a vast empire, and superpower status. But it would also have pushed humanity onto a distorted developmental path, where technical progress walked hand in hand with moral regression, where peace was merely a state of preparation for an even more terrifying apocalypse. History, with all its cruelty, seems to have chosen the least worst path for us. The sacrifice of millions of people on the Eastern Front, though painful, prevented the birth of 1,000 years of darkness under the shadow of the swastika. Hitler's decision to invade the Soviet Union was not just a military blunder, but the triumph of extreme ideology over strategic reason. By choosing the path of a war of annihilation, he signed the death warrant for his own regime and inadvertently salvaged the future of the free world. What do you think? If Germany didn't attack Russia and won in Europe, would our generation today exist to ask these questions? Or would we just be soulless numbers in a Germania ledger? Leave a comment, debate, and share your perspective below. Each of your opinions is a puzzle piece that helps us better understand the fragility of the peace we possess. If you found these deep analyses and fictional scenarios fascinating, don't forget to hit like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next journeys back in time. Click on the video appearing on the screen to learn about Plan Z, the German Navy's ambition for ocean domination, another puzzle piece in the Axis's insane ambitions. Thank you for watching, and see you in the upcoming Historical Secrets.